27th May, 1942. The streets of Prague moved with a strained stillness, an air of tension suffused into the quiet rhythms of daily life. It had been 1 year since the German Reich had declared the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia under the direct control of Reinhard Heydrich, the acting Reich's protector. The city bore the marks of occupation: swastikas draped from administrative buildings, Wehrmacht patrols at major intersections, and the ever-watchful presence of the Gestapo. Inside a dimly lit communications outpost tucked in the basement of an otherwise unremarkable apartment block in the Vinohrady district, a Czech radio operator named Jaroslav Švarc adjusted the dial on his receiver. The windows were blacked out and the stale smell of sweat, tobacco and machine oil clung to the walls. For months, Švarc had lived in isolation, speaking to no one save for encoded pulses of Morse that connected him with the intelligence networks in London. The operation had been given a name, Outdistance. It was one of several Czech intelligence missions launched by the British Special Operations Executive, designed to feed information back to exile leaders, assist local resistance, and coordinate sabotage. The operators dropped by parachute were supposed to set up secure transmissions with London. Some failed within days. A few, like Švarc, survived longer, living ghost-like among the occupation. On that morning he tuned into the static-laced shortwave band, scanning for a narrow signal window to begin his morning transmission. The previous night's weather report from London had indicated favourable conditions for contact. Timing was critical. Too early and the ionospheric bounce would distort the signal. Too late and the German radio detection units could triangulate his position. He had 20 minutes, maybe less. The faint rhythm of dots and dashes emerged from the noise, London's confirmation signal. He tapped back his station identifier. Each keystroke on the bake-like key felt like a calculated risk. Despite the methodical nature of the work, Švarc's movements remained precise, almost instinctive. Months of repetition had trained him to feel the tempo of safety and danger, of pause and pulse. Švarc had not been told about the details of Operation Anthropoid. That level of compartmentalization was intentional. Each team knew only what it needed to function. The men tasked with executing Heydrich's assassination, Jan Kubiš and Josef Gabčík, operated under strict secrecy. Even among fellow agents, names were rarely spoken aloud, and coded references were the only way to trace the human shape of resistance. Still, something in the tone of recent messages had shifted. In the past 2 weeks, the number of intercepts had grown, and the cipher length from London suggested more than routine coordination. Weather codes, usually mundane forecasts for drop operations, had come with altered formatting. Švarc had noticed it but said nothing aloud. Who would he say it to? His only companions were the wire-bound voices he could never meet, and the silence of the flat above, where a sympathetic landlady brought food and never asked questions. That morning's transmission was unremarkable in content. He sent a brief status report, confirmed safehouse stability, and requested battery parts and fresh encryption pads. As always, he ended the burst with the coded sign-off: "Will continue transmission at agreed time, condition normal." But conditions were not normal. Several hours earlier, he had caught part of a fragmented message on an unofficial Czech frequency, an old commercial band now used sporadically by resistance couriers and local informants. The voice was faint, broken by static, and too fast to record completely. But one phrase had struck him. Silver A has reported movement. Target still in transit. Silver A was another Czech parachute team, focused on coordinating with domestic resistance and relaying courier messages. Their use of the word target was not part of usual practice. Targets were rarely referenced directly. The moment hung in his mind as he shut down the transmitter, carefully disconnecting each component in the preset order designed to leave no heat traces for German detectors. He scribbled the phrase into a small pad, then burned the page in the makeshift stove next to the transmitter. Even coded fragments were dangerous if found. That was the nature of the work. Total silence. Total caution. As the morning turned to afternoon, the Prague streets began to stir with their usual subdued rhythm. Children in rationed clothes walked to school. Posters urging loyalty to the Reich fluttered on public boards. And above it all, in the administrative halls of the Prague castle, Reinhard Heydrich's schedule moved forward with mechanical precision. Švarc took no part in the political world above. He knew only his receiver. the fragile lines of transmission that stretched across Europe like threads in a vast unseen net. But inside him, he could sense a disturbance, a change in pattern. His operator's instinct, honed by months of listening, absorbing, reacting to the smallest variation in tone and phrasing, told him that something had shifted. A routine message that night confirmed only partial contact with a resistance liaison in Libène. The message had been relayed through civilian intermediaries and was vague, possibly tampered with. Švarc took it down nonetheless, noting that the source had insisted on the urgency of timing. Something about the motorcade. He did not yet know that Kubiš and Gabčík were already in position by the tram stop on Kirchmayerova Street. He did not know that Gabčík's Stain gun would jam, or that Kubiš's grenade would only partially wound the man inside the open-top Mercedes. He knew only that something was approaching, some operational wave building just outside his field of vision. For now, he recorded his logs in the usual way. He filed the transmission timestamp. He repacked the receiver into the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. And then, with habitual precision, he extinguished the candle by the stove, sat in silence for 15 minutes, and listened, just in case London had one more thing to say. He never heard a clear confirmation, only a long, irregular, static tone that didn't match any pattern he knew. By the early hours of 27 May 1942, Prague remained in the shadows of routine occupation. The city's rhythm had been dulled by surveillance, informants, and the ever-tightening grip of Nazi control. Posters displayed warnings in both German and Czech. Neighbourhood walls were often marked with quiet messages scratched in chalk, quickly erased, quickly replaced. And across the occupied Bohemian landscape, the resistance operated like an underground current, silent, fragmented, and dangerously incomplete. Jaroslav Švarc resumed his post that morning with a mechanical sense of duty. The night had yielded no further transmissions. The anomaly, the long irregular tone he had heard, had not repeated. He had attempted again at 3 hours and again at 4:30, each time carefully scanning the assigned frequencies, pausing to monitor nearby German police radio chatter for signs of detection teams. Nothing. He suspected the transmission had not originated from London. If it had, the rhythm would have followed known protocols. London's messages always followed a pattern: confirmation code, burst message, cipher identifier, and a closing signal. This, whatever it had been, offered no such structure. It could have been local interference, or worse, a compromised signal meant to flush operators like himself into the open. The Abwehr had experimented with such methods before. Still, the message from the resistance courier remained in his notes, now burned. It referenced a motorcade and movement reported by another cell. Fragments, unclear in their total meaning, but suggestive enough that Švarc began logging anything resembling related activity across Prague. One report noted unusual German military activity near Holešovice. Another came via a covert courier relay, a teenager paid in cigarettes, who said 2 men matching the right sort of clothes had been seen waiting near the Bulovka hospital line. Švarc passed that on in his next coded message, even though he wasn't certain it meant anything at all. Unbeknownst to him, the plan known as Operation Anthropoid had entered its final stages. The 2 men, Kubiš and Gabčík, had been observing Reinhard Heydrich's movements for weeks. The Reichsprotector had become predictable in his arrogance. He insisted on travelling in an open-top Mercedes without escort. His aides had cautioned him. So had the SS. But Heydrich, confident in his control over the Czech population, saw no need for extra security. Švarc did not know any of this. The resistance did not trust the safety of open communication. His instructions were clear: maintain operational transmission readiness, report local activity, assist where possible. Direct involvement was not expected, nor was it advisable. Still, the signs of friction had begun to show. At least 2 scheduled drops from London had failed in the past month. Resistance leaders in Brno had ceased contact, likely arrested or in hiding. The local Gestapo had increased patrols near suspected transmission zones, particularly in the industrial corridors of Šmíchov and Letná. One operator from Operation Zinc had reportedly been captured, although no confirmation had reached Švarc. More concerning was the change in the behaviour of Švarc's host. The woman, an elderly widow named Anna Vacheva, had kept to herself since his arrival 6 months earlier. She rarely spoke, never asked questions, and maintained a strictly predictable schedule. But in recent days she had begun to linger near the doorway when he entered. She offered him food without prompting. On one occasion, she handed him a folded newspaper, open to a photograph of Heydrich at a military event in Berlin. It was unusual. She said nothing, but her expression lingered, worried, questioning. Švarc couldn't afford to ignore the change. He moved the transmitter the following night, crawling through service corridors beneath the building to an unused coal room 2 floors down. The new position was less comfortable, but offered better shielding from German direction-finding equipment. He shortened his broadcast time to under 12 minutes and changed his signal start marker, hoping to disguise the familiar rhythm. These were survival tactics, not protocol. On the afternoon of 27 May, as he returned to the apartment, a sudden silence fell across the building. The usual distant clang of trams and the muted thrum of foot traffic had paused. He opened the window slightly and listened. Somewhere to the north, the distinct sound of sirens began. First one, then several, converging toward the Liben district. It was not uncommon. The Gestapo often responded with speed, especially when there were rumours of sabotage, but this sounded coordinated. An hour later, the German radio band issued a terse bulletin. No context, no commentary, just a directive for all military police and Ordnungspolizei to report to designated checkpoints near the northern tram lines. No civilian explanation was given. Still, Švarc maintained his routine. That evening's transmission went out with fewer words than usual. He referenced unusual movement in police sectors and flagged a change in courier activity near Troja Bridge. As always, he signed off with the code indicating that the station remained functional. At 21 hours, he caught another partial transmission, this time on a frequency associated with Czech exile groups. The voice was garbled, possibly transmitted with poor equipment, but the words came clear for just a few seconds. Attempt confirmed, condition of target unclear, evacuation underway. Švarc sat still for nearly a full minute. Attempt confirmed. It was the first time he'd heard such an acknowledgement on air. There was no mention of names, no indication of the location, but the implication was undeniable. An action had taken place, likely in Prague, likely against a target of significant rank. He did not need confirmation to understand what the phrase could mean. It was not the first time someone had tried to kill a senior Nazi figure. Most attempts failed. But Prague was not known for open action. The resistance was cautious, wary of retaliation. A public attack would signal something new, something dangerously bold. But even as this realization settled, the signal cut out. 10 minutes later, a sharp knock came at the apartment door. Švarc froze. No one ever knocked after curfew. He reached beneath the table and removed a small envelope containing a potassium cyanide capsule, his last recourse if discovered. He held it in his hand and stepped toward the door. It was the landlady. She looked shaken. In her hand was a crumpled leaflet, likely dropped by German units as part of a rapid information clampdown. She handed it to him wordlessly, her fingers trembling. The leaflet bore the Black Eagle insignia of the Reich. It listed a series of security orders, a warning against aiding saboteurs, and a brief, vague reference to an incident involving a senior government official earlier that day. No name, no location. But the scale of the response was beginning to form. Švarc closed the door quietly, slid the deadbolt into place, and returned to his work table. He carefully laid out the new cipher sheet, prepared a fresh log, and began noting all traffic he could monitor, German, Czech, and otherwise. The airwaves were crowded that night, and something, he could not yet know what, was unravelling inside the very architecture of Nazi authority in Prague. But he had no illusions. Whatever had happened, the response would be brutal. It would be immediate, and his own work, long considered auxiliary, now placed him squarely in the path of whatever came next. Night passed heavily over Prague. By the early morning of 28th of May 1942, checkpoints had sprung up across major intersections. Troops from the Ordnungspolizei and Waffen, SS patrolled tram lines, conducted sudden identity checks, and interrogated workers on their way to factories. The German command had issued no public details, but the breadth of the response made one fact clear. Something significant had occurred. Inside the converted basement room, Jaroslav Švarc sat over a page of hurriedly logged intercepts. His receiver buzzed faintly as he swept through the occupied frequency spectrum, his fingers steady despite the rising tension outside. In the past 12 hours, his notebooks had filled with fragments, unusual troop movements in Karlin, double checkpoint presence at the city's eastern entry points, and repeated transmissions between Gestapo command and an unnamed field detachment. There was no official bulletin, but the coded chatter and fragmented German voice transmissions all hinted at the same thing. Reinhard Heydrich had been attacked. What remained unknown was the outcome. The previous night's message, attempt confirmed, condition of target unclear, had been transmitted by an operator Švarc could not identify. It didn't match the rhythm or cadence of any known London contacts. Either it had been sent by another local resistance cell with equipment access, or was a hurried attempt by a courier to relay news before detection. Still, it had carried an urgency and tone that Švarc recognised instinctively. It was genuine, and it left him with a problem. His own orders allowed for routine transmissions and observational reporting. He had not been tasked with directly supporting any offensive action, but if Heydrich had truly been struck, if one of the highest-ranking Nazi officials in Europe had been wounded or killed, then London would need confirmation, and the local network would need coordination. There were few reliable operators left, and fewer still who remained undiscovered. As dawn settled across the city, a decision began to take shape. Švarc prepared a non-scheduled transmission, his first deviation from standard protocol since arriving. It was risky. Scheduled transmissions were expected by London and monitored with anticipated frequencies and timings. An unscheduled burst carried the risk of not being picked up at all, or worse, being intercepted by German radio surveillance teams, who were known to use mobile direction-finding trucks to triangulate signal sources, but the situation demanded it. He stripped down the message to essentials: unconfirmed reports of attack on Reichsprotector, 27/5 morning, extensive security reaction in Prague, no official communique, intercept suggest medical evacuation to German facility, local resistance silent, source unverified, will attempt further confirmation. J.Esh. It was brief, devoid of emotional interpretation, and carefully encoded using the current cipher pad. He transmitted it just after 0730 hours, during a known low monitoring window based on past patterns. The entire burst took less than 9 minutes. Afterward, he dismantled the transmitter, stored the components in their hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, and prepared his second contingency plan: relocation. He had no orders to move, but the presence of search patrols in nearby buildings had increased. 2 houses on the next street had been searched that morning. The excuse had been a missing ration booklet, but Švarc knew the signs. The net was tightening. He moved across the city later that afternoon under forged papers, disguised as a maintenance worker assigned to electric grid repairs. The papers were low quality, issued by a resistance contact several months earlier, and only meant for emergencies. But he had few alternatives. The new safe house was located in the Žižkov district, inside a crumbling tenement block occupied primarily by war widows and railway workers. The apartment was cramped, windowless, and poorly insulated, but it offered a line of sight to an unused telephone wire that Švarc could modify for antenna use. The landlady there, a stooped woman named Marta Skalova, was aware that her visitor was not who he claimed to be. But she asked no questions. Her son had been arrested in 1941 and never returned. That was enough. 2 days passed without confirmation. London sent no acknowledgement of the unscheduled message. Whether it had been received or lost in transmission, Švarc could not know. Each night he resumed normal contact at the designated time, offering updates as cautiously as possible. But without clear validation, he hesitated to include details that might compromise local networks or civilians. So he listened. On 30th May, he caught a German military dispatch, not encrypted, but terse and official in tone. It confirmed that SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich had been moved to Bulovka Hospital in Prague. The statement emphasized that despite an attempt on his life, the Reichsprotector remained alive and under medical supervision. No perpetrators were named, no circumstances were described, but for Švarc, it was enough. It was the first direct confirmation he had heard. The Germans, typically silent on internal disruptions, had been forced to acknowledge the event. That meant the attempt had not been minor. It had succeeded in injuring one of the most powerful men in occupied Europe. Švarc recorded the message and prepared a second report for London. This one, still brief, contained the hospital name, the official German language used in the statement, and the estimated time of relocation. He made no assumptions and speculated nothing. That was not his role. But as he read the message aloud during transmission that evening, he paused briefly at the phrase, "despite an attempt on his life." For a moment it struck him, not with elation, not even relief, but with the quiet gravity of knowing that something extraordinary had taken place. In the sterile language of coded reports and intercepted frequencies, a line had been crossed, and with it, the risk had changed. The nature of the work had always been dangerous, but now it was no longer a matter of silent observation. The Germans would respond, harshly, unpredictably, and without restraint. Švarc knew the operational manuals issued in London anticipated retaliation, but they could not account for what a man like Heydrich represented to the regime. His name was synonymous with terror, with the Reich's bureaucratic precision of cruelty. An attack on him would be seen not only as an act of violence, but as heresy. That night, as Prague remained under curfew and a soft rain fell over its cobbled alleys, Švarc prepared for a new reality. His position, once peripheral to the broader movements of war, was now something else. He did not need orders to recognize it. The risk was no longer abstract. It had become personal. By the morning of 31st May 1942, Prague had undergone a visible transformation. Concrete roadblocks appeared overnight at major crossings. Barbed wire now ringed government buildings. Military patrols stopped trams without warning and pulled men from queue lines with increasing aggression. Loudspeakers on utility poles repeated warnings in Czech and German. Anyone withholding information will be treated as an accomplice to terrorism. Inside the tenement flat in Žižkov, Jaroslav Švarc was already preparing his next transmission. He no longer used the same window position for the antenna. The layout was rotated every 48 hours now. He slept in 2-hour intervals, waking in the night to listen to irregular bursts on the resistance frequency. More often than not, they were empty, or worse, decoys. Still, he persisted in sending updates to London, though these messages grew more cautious by necessity. He no longer used place names. He removed details that could compromise anyone should the cipher fall into the wrong hands. What remained were fragments, shapes of information carved down to their smallest, safest forms. On 1st June, a courier arrived under pretense of checking the wiring in the stairwell. He handed Švarc a folded piece of brown wrapping paper tucked inside a bundle of wire insulation. The note was written in code, familiar to those trained in London's cryptographic system. Confirmed. Target remains in Bulovka under guard. German search for attackers escalating. Several informants compromised. High probability. Safe houses no longer secure. Cease contact with known points. Silver contact moved east. Further orders pending. The confirmation that Heydrich had survived, at least for now, did not change Švarc's immediate circumstances, but it hardened the expectation. Retaliation was no longer a question of if, but when and where. And within that window, the German command would begin a relentless tightening of its grip. It would not stop with arrests. By 2nd June, that retaliation began. The first signs came in the form of public bulletins, a list of names and photographs posted across Prague. Accomplices to the attempted murder of the Reich's protector, the posters declared. Some of the names were known to Švarc, mid-level resistance operatives, former army contacts, even a few civilians known for sympathies rather than actions. Others were unfamiliar, likely rounded up for reasons of proximity or convenience. What struck him most was the language. The charges were not stated as suspected. They were declared as certain. Guilt had already been assigned. Trials, if they occurred, would be ceremonial. He updated his logs accordingly. On the 3rd June, the Gestapo raided a building 3 blocks from his current location. The search lasted 6 hours, involving dogs, floodlights, and interrogators brought in from Berlin. Eyewitnesses reported screams, followed by the removal of 7 bodies under tarpaulins. Švarc monitored the German security frequency during the raid and noted 2 short encrypted bursts, both sent to an SS signals post near Tbilisi. After the raid, Marta Skalova, his landlady, knocked on the door with shaking hands and handed him a plate of cold dumplings. She said nothing, but her eyes lingered on the floor where the wires had recently run. He thanked her and placed the plate aside. He would not eat it. That evening, a message arrived from London. It was a terse acknowledgement of his previous updates. No request for expansion, no inquiry into his condition, just 2 lines. Continue as able. Further instructions suspended pending outcome. Exercise full caution. It was as close as London would ever come to admitting that the operation had moved beyond control. On 4th June, at precisely 16:30, German state radio interrupted its usual programming with a broadcast that echoed across every receiver in the Protectorate. The voice was cold, emotionless, clipped with bureaucratic finality. Reichsprotector Reinhard Heydrich, Obergruppenführer of the SS, succumbed to his injuries this afternoon following complications from wounds sustained on 27 May. Funeral arrangements are to be held in Berlin. A full investigation is underway. Justice will be carried out without delay. Švarc did not move as the words reached his ears. He did not write anything down. For a long moment he simply sat staring at the blank sheet in front of him. There had been rumours of sepsis, of surgery complications, but now it was fact. Heydrich was dead. That same night the city began to convulse. Mass arrests swept across Prague and the surrounding countryside. Curfews were enforced with live ammunition. Gestapo teams raided known resistance channels. Homes and businesses tied even loosely to past military records. Radios were confiscated en masse. The streets fell into a kind of muffled terror. The next morning another courier arrived, this time bearing no message, only a whispered warning. Do not return here tonight. All known drop houses are under surveillance. Movement only at night. Use southern routes. Jalivskeho station compromised. Švarc understood what it meant. There would be no more safe communication within Prague. The city had been turned into a trap. And then, on 9th of June, came the name Lidis. The Germans announced that the village northwest of Prague had been liquidated in reprisal. Every adult male had been executed. Women were deported. Children were separated. Some sent to Germany, others vanished. The village itself was destroyed. Burned. Bulldozed. Erased. The radio message from Berlin said simply, "For harbouring the assassins of our fallen comrade." But there had been no evidence, no trial, no verification. The name had been chosen, perhaps at random, perhaps as a warning. For Švarc, the line between observer and participant had long since blurred. He no longer saw his work as detached. He no longer clung to the protections of his original orders. The risk had become personal the day he had transmitted an unscheduled message. Now it was existential. In his next transmission, likely his last from Prague, he wrote nothing about operational logistics. He did not mention codes, frequencies, or supply needs. Instead, he sent this. Protector dead. Prague locked down. Civilian reprisals underway. Lidis destroyed. Contact with network unsustainable. Evacuation plans improbable. Will remain active until captured or signal failure. Continuing surveillance of enemy traffic. Awaiting opportunity. It was not defiance. It was resignation. A commitment made not to victory but to endurance. As the message faded into the static, Švarc switched off the transmitter, packed the components into a cloth sack, and slipped out into the darkness. The city he had known, its alleys, its voices, its rhythms, was gone, replaced now by silence, fire, and the sound of boots on stone. In the days following Reinhard Heydrich's death, Prague ceased to function as a normal city. What remained was an occupied zone under siege, governed by fear rather than administration. For Jaroslav Švarc, the work did not end. It narrowed. The margins for action collapsed until only observation, movement, and survival remained. Radio traffic became sparse, then erratic. German units saturated the airwaves with encrypted coordination messages, many of them repeating or deliberately misleading. Resistance frequencies fell silent one by one. Some were shut down intentionally, others disappeared without explanation. Švarc could no longer assume that silence meant caution. It often meant capture. He abandoned his final fixed position 2 days after his last transmission to London, carrying only what he could conceal under a worker's coat. He moved southward through the city at night, sleeping in stairwells, storage sheds, and once inside an abandoned tram carriage near the depot at Pankrak. He avoided contact with known resistance figures. Familiarity had become a liability. The Gestapo response expanded beyond Prague. Entire regions were placed under emergency jurisdiction. Summary executions were carried out daily. Lists of names were read aloud on public radio broadcasts, followed by instructions that citizens were required to listen. Failure to report information, even unknowingly, was defined as collaboration. Švarc listened when he could. He no longer logged transmissions. Paper was dangerous. Memory was safer. The destruction of Lidis was followed 2 weeks later by the annihilation of Ležáky. This time, the justification was clearer. A radio transmitter had been found nearby. The village had harboured couriers linked to the Silvera group. Every adult was executed. Children were deported or killed. The message was unmistakable. Radio work, once considered a support role, was now treated as equivalent to armed insurrection. For Švarc, this confirmation carried a grim clarity. He was no longer merely an observer relaying information. In the eyes of the occupying power, he was a weapon. On 16th June 1942, a break came, not in his favour. The Gestapo arrested a resistance courier named Karel Čurda, one of the men originally involved in the Anthropoid network. Under interrogation, Čurda broke. He provided names, locations, fragments of safe house routes. Some information was outdated, some was wrong. But enough was accurate to allow the Germans to begin reconstructing the web that had sustained the assassination team. Within days, Gestapo units closed in on remaining nodes. Švarc learned of the betrayal indirectly, through a brief intercept on a German internal frequency referencing confirmation from surrendered parachutist. He did not know the name, but he understood the consequence. The net was no longer blind. On 18th of June, German forces surrounded the Orthodox Church of Saints Cyril and Methodius in Prague. Inside were the surviving members of the Anthropoid group. The siege lasted hours. When it ended, all resistance fighters inside were dead, some by gunfire, others by suicide to avoid capture. Švarc did not witness the event, but he heard its echo in the radio traffic that followed. Terse confirmations, casualty counts, and instructions for immediate expansion of arrests. Prague's remaining resistance infrastructure collapsed almost overnight. There would be no evacuation. London sent no further instructions. Whether the station had been shut down deliberately or simply overwhelmed by events, Švarc could not know. He attempted contact twice more, weeks apart, each time receiving nothing but static. Eventually he dismantled his transmitter permanently and disposed of the components in separate locations across the city. The work, as he had known it, was finished. What remained was survival. By late summer 1942, the mass reprisals began to taper, not because the occupation softened, but because there was little left to dismantle. Thousands had been executed, tens of thousands arrested, entire families erased from records. The Protectorate entered a phase of enforced quiet. Švarc went underground in the truest sense of the word. He obtained false papers identifying him as a railway maintenance clerk assigned to Moravia. The documents were crude but plausible. He moved east, away from Prague, avoiding cities, taking short-term labour where possible. He did not transmit. He did not make contact. The silence was intentional. Years later, after the war, investigators would attempt to reconstruct the radio networks that operated in occupied Czechoslovakia. They would find fragments, intercept logs, Gestapo reports, testimonies from surviving civilians. Some operators would be identified, others would remain names without faces, call signs without biographies. Švarc was one of the latter. His role did not appear in official after-action reports. He was not credited in public commendations. His transmissions were logged, used, and filed away without annotation. That was the nature of the work. Radio operators were meant to be invisible, useful only as long as the signal held. What he had heard in the hours before the assassination was never recorded as a decisive moment. There was no single message that changed the outcome, no warning that could have altered events. What he heard was something quieter, the subtle distortion of routine, the shift in tone that signalled an irreversible act was already in motion. In the end, that was the limit of his influence. After 1945, the story of Heydrich's assassination became a symbol of resistance and sacrifice. The names of Kubiš and Gabčík were honoured, the villages of Lidis and Ležáky were remembered. The cost was acknowledged, though never fully counted. The radio operators remained largely absent from public memory. They had worked alone, in silence, hearing fragments without context, sending information into darkness without confirmation it would ever be received. Their reward was not recognition, but survival, if they were fortunate. Jaroslav Švarc was fortunate enough to live. He did not speak publicly about the war. He didn't publish memoirs. When asked years later about his role, he described it simply as a listening. He never claimed to know more than he did. He never suggested his actions had altered the course of events. But in the hours before Reinhard Heydrich's assassination, he had been there, at the edge of history, hearing its approach not through headlines or declarations, but through static, broken signals and the faint, unmistakable sense that something had gone beyond recall.